These days, nearly every company is a technology company, or they better become one soon, even yours. And businesses that embrace this kind of thinking will stand apart, but like everything make or break, a change like this brings new complications, new obstacles, like finding the right talent, and just keeping up with the pace of innovation and customer expectations of quality and speed that are, let's just say, challenging. Build as a Service helps organizations clear the hurdles, providing the ability to not only compete, but lead. Built on the as a service model, BaaS is your seamless access to the right expertise, working in teams to rapidly create and deliver. Totally flexible, totally scalable, and absolutely predictable. Build as a Service is that always ready, instantly available engine that helps you craft custom-built modern software, the software your business runs on, and the products and experiences your customers love, all while harnessing the data that helps you see around corners, so you always know what's coming. You could say that Build as a Service is all about closing the distance between concept and creation, ideation and revolution, now and next. And it'll help you build your future today.
In this episode, I'm going to talk with Abhi, who used to work in the quality assurance industry or quality engineering, as we refer to it here at Slalom Build, and made a transition to the DevOps industry later on. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, so let's just dive right in. Abhi, welcome to the show. Really great to have you here today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ryan.
So Abhi, we're here to talk about, you told me that you're in terms of a background, you kind of like switch from QA to DevOps, right? So that's going to be a super interesting conversation. I think you're the first guest that made this transition here that came to the show. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. But before we get to that, how about you just introduce yourself so others can get to know you?
Sure. So I'm Abhi Regmi. I'm currently an architect at Slalom. I've been there for 2 years. Prior to this, I've worked in many industries, a lot of e-commerce, white labeling, and I transitioned from QE. I think it's been roughly about maybe five years or so.
And so before we talk about that transition, so when you made a transition to DevOps, I just wanted to ask you as an icebreaker, what were the first three technologies, like DevOps technologies, that you learned? Do you remember?
It's an excellent question. So I think the first three, we were using TeamCity at the time. TeamCity, I think it was Octopus Deploy, and TeamCity Octopus Deploy. And I would say maybe a Bitbucket pipelines. Those are the three that were immediately relevant. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, on my side, I think my first one was Jenkins. That was the first one that I learned, and then after that, I transitioned to Docker, and then after that, CloudFormation.
Oh man, that's
just kind of like all over the place.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so Abhi, so before we talk about your transition, so how did you actually start in the industry? Did you start in the quality assurance industry, or you started as a developer? Yeah.
Sure. So initially, I used to do a lot of automation, just when I was playing games and whatnot, and that kind of grew my love for programming. Then I enrolled in comp sci, and eventually, I think initially I wanted to go into security because it's always fun. Who doesn't want to be a hacker? But actually, I first started with some freelance development work, and I realized that was definitely not for me. It was quite difficult just finding clients and everything, dealing with the clients. So at that point, one of my friends, actually, she saw that there was a QA position open, and she was asking if I was interested in it, and I had absolutely no idea what QA was, so I figured why not. And I actually learned about the role maybe the day before the interview, and so interview went well, and that's how I started off as a QA.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think it's might be good for us to kind of introduce the terms for those who are not aware. So in terms of quality assurance, what do you do exactly?
Sure. So quality assurance, this was actually this was a whole can of worms because QA can also be quality assurance and quality assistance. So initially, when I started the job, we were going with QA as quality assurance, and what that meant was essentially anytime there was a change, we were doing a waterfall model. My team, we worked backwards. We did a lot of testing to make sure that the functionality that we previously had worked, and we ensured that the new functionality that we were creating also worked. So that's the quality assurance side of things. And we were responsible for making sure that everything was properly tested.
I see. So I guess there's a lot of like, do you need to know programming language for quality assurance, or it's more scripting like Bash, etc.?
So actually, the first time when I started, it was actually manual testing. So the barrier to entry is quite low. Essentially, what you need is you need a bit of a programmer's mindset. You need to be very analytical. You need to be able to break down tasks into very there's no other way to say it. It's very tedious, right? You want to be very thorough. You want to make sure that you think of different possibilities and go through them. But yeah, if I'm not sure how common those are anymore, but I think that's probably the best way to start getting into software development is manual QA testing. There is absolutely no requirement aside from the fact that you really want to be a QA.
That's interesting. And I think in a way, it's kind of like you becoming a user and testing the tool, but you're just, doing that for that company, right? You're
Exactly.
hired by that company.
Yes.
And so I heard from someone that you need to really think outside of the box sometimes, because it's not just about the features that you're developing, but, the users, they don't know, right? This is some features, et cetera. So you need to think like them.
Exactly. And just one example of that is I think it was a few years back, like I guess QA missed this, but like for a banking application, you could send comments and whatnot, and if you put any sort of emoji, it crashed their entire system. So little things like that outside the box thinking definitely goes quite a long ways.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I wanted to go over this conversation, especially because some people here might want to be transitioning to DevOps, but others maybe they're interested in QA, right? So that's why I wanted to start the conversation like that. But and then in terms of your transition, so how was that exactly for you to transition from QA to DevOps? How was the like in terms of challenges that you had when you made that transition?
Sure. So just to speak a little bit about the company I was working at the time was I find this is a common theme was that DevOps at the time was severely understaffed, and everyone was trying to get a hold of them. So in my case, I needed an environment to start my testing, and we had one DevOps engineer for maybe like 30 developers. It was crazy. So it was impossible to get a hold of him. So what I did was I just went and I tried to do the things myself. So that's how I started my DevOps career, was essentially just looking at what was already there in that team and trying to replicate it. I'm sure I caused quite a few headaches just learning the ropes by doing things completely incorrectly. But that's what I found worked the best for me, was just see what was already there and maybe just explore a bit, play around with it.
Yeah, and that's how you learn as well, right? Because in the beginning you're gonna make mistakes, etc. But I think it's important for our organization to give you that opportunity, which is what happened to myself. So when I was learning like let's say CloudFormation, so all of their infrastructure was manually managed, and so I basically just asked to them, hey, I learned about this new technology that I can automate all the infrastructure and so on. Would you give me an opportunity to try it out? And they did, right? So I think that's also something that is very important for those who want to transition, because it's really hard for you to transition and know everything straight away, right? You're gonna have to go through all these challenges. You're gonna make mistakes, and I think that's totally fine, right?
Yeah, I think that was the number one thing that I had to learn, was that you are going to fail. You're going to fail often. You're going to fail every day, and that shouldn't be seen as anything other than success, because you're going to grow from that.
Exactly. Yeah. So after myself as well, after many failures, so that's when I started having my first successes, and right. So failure is just part of the process, right? And so the challenge that you had when you transitioned. So did you have any challenge in terms of learning the
Oh, of
technologies
course.
because they were so different?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my first role, I was a bit familiar with the stack because I'd been working as a QE, so I kind of understood the tools a bit. But so that's how I actually got my first job. Was I was learning these tools, and they were actually short staffed, and they were looking to hire. And they said, "Hey, we know this QA guy. He keeps bothering us. He keeps coming and asking these questions. Why don't we just get him on the team? That way, we can actually just have him. We can train him, and he can help other people as well." So that initial one, I found that was probably the best way to start learning tools, was because I was a bit familiar with them. The real issue started when I actually switched from that position into my into a different company. So I went from on-premise and kind of understanding the stack to a brand new company where everything was different. I didn't know what a container was. I didn't know what Kubernetes was. My networking was not the best. And that was, I find, probably the hardest time in my DevOps career. Learning, you not only do you have to learn a whole bunch of tools, you have to learn new methodologies. And honestly, just having a great manager who understood that this is something that you can't just do overnight. Once again, like, you have to take your time, you have to learn things. And I found that's the best way. Just learn on the job. There's so many things, and you cannot be expected to learn everything. Like, even now, it's constantly evolving. So I think tooling is definitely one of the hardest things in DevOps to keep up to date with.
Yeah, in technology, it moves so fast that we always need to keep up and learn something new, right? Sometimes people think that you're going to learn one thing and that's it, that's forever, but definitely not, at least not in our industry, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so, well, I'm happy that they gave an opportunity to actually learn all these things because I know how hard it is. Like I also went through that, and I think what's the most important for everyone to understand is that you need to have patience with yourself, right? Because all of these technologies, they're pretty new if you think, right? Right now, Docker was back in what, 2013, 14. Kubernetes the same thing, so it's relatively new and it's pretty complex for those who are just starting in the industry now. So what would be your advice for those who are wanting to make a transition, or they want to learn this technology? So in terms of strategies, how they can go about doing that?
I think it's the best strategy is just do it. There is nothing stopping you from just, let's say you have a task. If you want to maybe learn how to set up a web server, you could just Google how to set up a web server in Docker, and you can just start. I think it seems quite daunting just looking at all these tools and different technologies, but there is no other way to do it than to just do it. I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to ask, so with me personally, I came from a development background. And so when I transitioned to DevOps, for me, it was really useful, the knowledge that I have in development, especially when it came to, developing Lambda functions to help with automation and this sort of things. But with you coming from the quality assurance industry, how those skills actually helped you in DevOps?
Right. So I think QA just skills translate very well into DevOps because one of the big things is just understanding the difference between how things are working and how they're supposed to work. So one of the many cases is in DevOps, how do you know if you've deployed something correctly? It's a bit hard to say, right? Like, if you have a script that brings up an EC2 instance, um, yeah, how do you know that that instance is brought up correctly? It could just come up and then you don't know. There might be a lot of settings missing from it. So I think one of the big things is just understanding how to test in general. That knowledge can be applied directly to infrastructure, to processes as well. Just the ability to test something, I think it's invaluable, and it's something that I find it's not something you can just pick up unless you actually pay a lot of attention to it. So one example is going back to the bank. They didn't expect emojis, in terms of infrastructure, you might not expect some sort of input to come from somewhere. Just having an understanding and trying to expect something before it happens is quite a valuable skill.
I see. And do you think now in the industry, like the QA part is kind of like forgotten, or do you see a lot of organizations, using QE in DevOps QA actually?
Yeah, so that's something I definitely think is missing. A lot of people forgo testing until it's too late. So that was true in software, right? Like when you develop software, it's much cheaper to find issues beforehand. If you go to production and you have an outage, that's going to cost a lot more to fix. And I think we're seeing that to be true in DevOps as well. There's a lot of tools that you can use to actually deploy infrastructure, but there aren't a lot of people that are testing infrastructure that is deployed. It's not only in terms of infrastructure as well. Like, for example, when you're deploying APIs, there are many ways to test APIs and ensure that they will work in very complex systems. And I don't think there's a lot of testing around that. One example in specific is contract testing. That's something that I have not seen any company do, but it is something that would allow you to develop and catch issues much sooner. So you don't have to suddenly go to production and see, hey, my entire website is down. I could have probably tested this a lot sooner.
Right. And when you talk about tests, I think a lot of people think about, unit tests and so on. So what kind of tests are you talking about for infrastructure more specifically?
Right. So there's some ways you might be able to test just specifically infrastructure is to see, like, when you bring up infrastructure, if it has the correct permissions required. In terms of infrastructure, you can also do performance testing. So let's say you have brought up auto scaling set. If you don't actually test that auto scaling set and you're like an e-commerce site and it's Black Friday, you might have lost out on millions of dollars. So just an example of testing is if you create an auto scale set, maybe you also have some sort of performance test that verifies that your skill set actually does scale properly. That's the type of testing that could go quite a long ways.
Right. Okay. And for those who are, because right now we've been talking about those, for those who transition from QA to DevOps, but what if you have someone that works in DevOps and they want to get into testing a little bit more? Where do you suggest they get started? Like, what kind of tools should they learn? What kind of like testing techniques should they learn first?
Right. So I think more than technologies, it's better to understand the mindset of how testing works. One common pitfall that I've seen is a lot of people understand that Selenium is a tool that's used often in testing, and they'll just start learning how to use Selenium. That doesn't really help you with the fundamentals of testing, such as what a testing pyramid is. So I think rather than understanding technologies, it's much better to start with the fundamentals of testing. And just a good starting point for that is just understanding what a testing pyramid is.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. And that's something that I myself, I asked that question because I'm trying to get a little bit more into testing as well, right? Back when I was a developer, it's very natural for us to test the software, but when it transitions to infrastructure, it might not be that natural, right? We launch things, but not necessarily think about, okay, so is it actually working, or how can I actually test it? Right. We know that, we have usually the QA team that tests the software, and that might tell you about the infrastructure itself. But sometimes you have issues with the software that, the culprit is the infrastructure, but there's no way to know just by looking at the software,
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's why it's also important for you to take that step and test the infrastructure as well. Right. And so, that was super interesting story. I really thank you for sharing that. Here on the show, we always play a little game at the end with our guests. Are you up for it? Should we try it?
Sure. Yeah, why not?
All right, let's do it. All right, so this is a little game that for those who watched already, they're familiar with. So just to quickly explain, I have 10 questions here. I'm just going to spin the wheel. And if you don't feel comfortable answering some of the questions, let me know and we'll skip it. and
Sure.
then we're gonna go over 3 questions in total.
All right.
All right. All right. So let's start with the first one. Let's see. Okay. So, what's the role of soft skills and DevOps?
Very exciting. So DevOps, you do not, once again, DevOps, one of the pillars of DevOps is that you do not work in silos. What that means is you're going to have to communicate with other people and other teams. And oftentimes the ideas that you present might be very contradictory to the goals of a developer. You might be giving them work. So maybe like trying to explain how this will help them rather than just be like, here, start doing this. It's quite a skill that will take you quite far without having other teams hate you. So soft skills.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, because before, when you had this dev and operation, it was a lot, developers, they would just work on their code and pass it on to the infrastructure or the operations team. There was no communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that I think people don't realize, that the communication is a very important aspect, and also being able to share information. Yeah. So it's not just about you go and write something and don't explain that to everyone else. All the team needs to be aware. You need to be like a single team pretty much, right?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is the developers need to understand that you're trying to help them. So help me, help you,
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, awesome. So let's go to the next one. All right, let's see what we get.
Ooh.
Oh, all right. So infrastructure knowledge, you think that's crucial to succeed in DevOps?
I would believe so. It is quite a pillar, but it depends. Like if you have specialized to a point where the only thing you work on is, let me think. Is there anything you can do where you don't have to work with infrastructure? If you're only a build engineer that sits there all day and you optimize build like platforms and that's it, even then you'd have to create the platform to build on. So I don't think there is any way to get around infrastructure knowledge. Everything boils down to some sort of infrastructure. No matter what work you do, it's going to run on something, and you need to understand what it's running on. So I don't think there's any way to get around it.
Right. Yeah, because I think for someone to get started in the industry, in the DevOps industry, it might not be necessarily required. Like I didn't have infrastructure knowledge when I started. I guess you mentioned that you also didn't have infrastructure knowledge, right? But once you get into the industry and you keep going, then I think it's naturally you're gonna have to learn some infrastructure. Right? I think that's what we're trying to say here, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Now on to the third one. Okay. So how about the sentence here? So DevOps is collaboration only between the dev and operations team. Do you think that's true? Do you think that's false?
Seeing as how I come from a QA background, I would say this is probably not true.
That's an easy one for you to answer, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of forgotten pieces in there, but exactly. Like, so for example, the example I just brought up, like when I was in QE, I needed to have an environment to test on. That's a direct relationship between QA and the DevOps team. Yeah, that was
I guess not only QA and even other teams as well, like security, for example, right? A lot of people forget about the security aspect, and so you also need to involve the security team. And yeah, so definitely not just dev and operation. There is way more than just these two
the whole
teams.
ecosystem. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, Abhi. So just before we finish the episode, I have one more question for you, if you don't mind. So, for organizations that are trying to, get into DevOps, what kind of advice would you have for them?
In terms of advice, I would say just be kind to the DevOps team. I know a lot of these new, like the companies that are trying to adopt DevOps, they might hire like one or two people, and then you have like they're serving 30 developers and everyone's trying to get answers and whatnot. You need to understand that this is an iterative process. It's not something that'll happen overnight. So if your DevOps engineer suddenly tries out something new and it doesn't work and it breaks and 30 developers run at them, it's quite daunting. So maybe be a little kind to them.
It's not the easiest of a task, right?
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely like, especially when you're talking about a whole organization, right? There are different size of organization, of course,
yeah.
but especially for the big ones, it's
Oh,
definitely a huge challenge, right?
exactly. Yeah.
All right, Abby. So thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm pretty sure the audience enjoyed listening to all of your journey in the industry. And so, well, how can people contact you?
I have my LinkedIn. It's
Mhm.
shared here, hopefully somewhere.
I'll put it there.
Yeah. LinkedIn, feel free to connect if you have questions, comments, whatever you want. Your DevOps guy messed up and you just need someone to rant at. Feel free to shoot me a message. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much again, Abby.
Yep. Thank you.
What's up, builders? Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Build DevOps Show. If you did enjoy this episode, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button in our channel. And to be notified when we release new episodes, please turn on notifications and join our meetup group so that you can stay up to date with all of our new releases, workshops, and much more. Until next time.